It begins with a tension so subtle that most people never notice it, a fracture running quietly beneath the surface of human history. The more one lingers with the earliest records of civilization, the more a strange dissonance takes shape, as if the story we inherited was patched together too neatly, too confidently, to cover something older that no one can quite touch anymore. Archaeologists often describe the rise of early civilizations as a sudden flowering, but that phrase, gentle as it sounds, hides a deeper discomfort. Flowers do not bloom overnight. Cities do not appear from silence. Writing does not emerge fully formed, its symbols already carrying the weight of law, astronomy, and myth. Yet this is exactly what the evidence suggests, a sharp pivot, roughly 6,000 years ago, when humanity shifted from scattered villages to monumental states, from oral memory to carved tablets, from seasonal observation to calculated cycles encoded in stone. Something about that leap feels strangely abrupt, as though the world before it belonged to another rhythm, another memory entirely. In the dim glow of ancient Sumer, the first cities rose not as tentative experiments, but as sprawling urban organisms. Uruk, with its great courtyard temples and administrative districts, appearing almost fully developed in the archaeological layers. Before it stood a landscape of smaller settlements, scattered and simple. Nothing in those earlier layers predicts the scale that follows. It is as if a blueprint arrived from somewhere unseen, guiding hands that had never built on such a scale before. Some scholars describe it cautiously, others avoid the subject altogether, but the discrepancy remains unresolved. Why does the shift feel like a beginning built atop the remnants of something already lost? The same echo appears in Egypt. Pre-dynastic communities leave behind pottery, simple graves, scattered stone tools. Then suddenly, with a force that feels almost theatrical, there are mastabas, hieroglyphs, planned ceremonial complexes, and astronomical orientations precise enough to suggest generations of accumulated knowledge. Yet the layers beneath do not show those generations. They whisper of an absence instead, a gap where the steps leading upward should have been. Egyptologists propose explanations: rapid socio-political integration, environmental pressures, symbolic experimentation. Still, the feeling persists that something is missing, like a chapter ripped from the middle of a book, leaving the next page impossible to understand. The Indus Valley tells a similar story. Around the same time frame, Var cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa appear, laid out in grids that would not be common elsewhere for thousands of years. Uniform weights and measures, standardized brick ratios, advanced water management, all present from the earliest layers of urban occupation, and yet the precursors, the transitional form, are strangely faint. The civilization seems to step into history fully clothed, carrying systems far too mature for their archaeological adolescence. Some researchers argue that we simply have not found the earlier layers yet, that the ground has swallowed them. Floods, shifting rivers, and millennia of erosion could erase entire landscapes. Perhaps the evidence is merely hidden, or waiting. But if that is so, why do these sudden appearances happen in 3 different regions, across thousands of kilometers, within the same narrow slice of time? Why does the 6,000-year mark appear like a veil dropping across continents? It may be coincidence, or it may hint at a deeper rhythm of civilization, one that rises, collapses, and is later remembered only as faint instinct. There are tablets in Mesopotamia that complicate the picture further. The Sumerian scribes wrote matter-of-factly about antediluvian kings ruling for impossible spans of time, about an era before the flood where knowledge was given, not discovered. Most historians treat these as symbolic or mythic, grounding them in the same tradition of cosmic storytelling found in creation myths worldwide. Yet the persistence of these before-the-flood memories across cultures is difficult to ignore. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, from early China to the Indian subcontinent, there exists a strangely consistent narrative. The notion of a forgotten age, interrupted by catastrophe, after which humanity began again. But what does again mean? Did the survivors carry fragments of something older, mathematical ideas, symbolic systems, architectural instincts that surfaced only when conditions allowed? And if so, where is the full record of that older world? Why do the layers preserve every small detail of daily life yet remain silent about the origins of such profound knowledge? Anthropologists sometimes speak of cultural amnesia, how societies can lose entire bodies of knowledge within a handful of generations if the chain of transmission breaks. Droughts, migrations, wars, diseases, and climate shocks all fracture memory. The 5.9 kilo-year aridification event, occurring not long before the rise of these civilizations, dramatically reshaped the world. The Sahara dried, the river shifted, populations clustered into shrinking habitable zones. It is possible that communities bearing older knowledge dispersed or collapsed, leaving behind only echoes that later societies rediscovered without understanding their true origins. Even so, the scale of the discontinuity is unsettling. The distance between Neolithic villages and the earliest written records feels like a chasm, a darkness so complete that one cannot help wondering whether the gap is natural or curated. Many early priesthoods controlled writing, astronomy, and ritual knowledge tightly. What was preserved depended on what they chose to copy and what they believed should be forgotten. The earliest libraries we know of already contain texts that refer to older, missing works. The first catalogues mentioned scrolls whose titles survived but whose contents vanished long before modern scholars arrived. It creates a haunting sensation that we are reading footnotes to chapters that no longer exist. The silence is not merely academic. It has a tone, a temperature, an emotional gravity. When you lean into it, you sense not emptiness but erasure, like a palimpsest scraped clean so new ink could be written over the old. And perhaps that is why the 6,000-year boundary feels so significant. It does not behave like the natural evolution of culture. It feels like the beginning of something rebuilt after an unspoken ending. The question that arises is not whether a lost civilization existed. There is no need for grand conclusions, and no single evidence demands one. The deeper question is why our earliest surviving histories behave like memories reconstructed after a trauma. Why does the rise of civilization feel less like an ascent and more like a resurfacing? And if this resurfacing began 6 millennia ago, what then lies beneath the silt of those forgotten centuries, hidden from sight but not entirely erased from the human story? The night holds its breath around that question, as though waiting for someone to step toward the edge of the unknown and listen carefully for the echo returning from the past. There is a heaviness lingering over the earliest layers of urban life, a faint residue of intention that should not be there. When one moves from the theoretical to the tactile, from reading interpretations to examining the stones themselves, the sense of dissonance deepens. These are the layers that archaeologists sometimes describe with caution. The levels where something seems out of sequence. In Uruk, for instance, the earliest monumental structures stand not as early prototypes, but as confident declarations of an architectural language already understood. The Anna precinct rises with complex courtyards and administrative sectors arranged in ways that suggest long refinement. Yet the strata below do not support such a lineage. It is as though the foundation remembers techniques left behind by hands that no longer existed when the walls were raised. The pattern repeats across regions that should have developed independently. In the Nile Valley, pre-dynastic tombs show a progression of simple pits and modest constructions. Then, almost abruptly, stone mastabas appear, geometrically precise, aligned with celestial markers, and engineered far beyond what their immediate predecessors imply. Scholars have attempted to map transitions through pottery styles, burial orientations, and iconographic motifs. But the progression reads like a set of disconnected steps rather than a continuum. Something in the line of transmission seems to have snapped, leaving the first monumental builders to operate with knowledge that cannot be fully traced backward. Some have proposed that these leaps reflect the inherent unpredictability of cultural evolution. Human societies sometimes change rapidly in response to climate stress, migration, or novel organizational structures, yet even within those frameworks, there is usually a trail of incremental experimentation. What is troubling here is the absence of such traces. The earliest complex structures in Egypt and Mesopotamia emerge as near-finished ideas. The levels beneath them feel too quiet, lacking the expected failures, miscalculations, or alternate forms that typically accompany innovation. It resembles not invention, but reassembly, like someone remembering a language they once heard but cannot fully articulate. The megalithic traditions add their own dimension to this puzzle. Sites such as Nabta Playa, with its astronomical alignments dating to the end of the Neolithic, seem almost to foreshadow later precision. Yet the people who marked those stones left no cities, no written records, and no architectural lineage. The alignments exist as isolated flashes of sophisticated observation, drifting in the archaeological record like embers from a fire that burned elsewhere. Then, centuries later, societies that should have had no connection to these earlier markings adopt similar methods, as if answering a memory carried only in fragments. The deeper one moves into the structural details, the more discordant elements emerge. The earliest temples in Mesopotamia were built using millions of mud bricks, requiring coordinated production, labor organization, and logistical planning. But such systems do not arise spontaneously. The question then becomes, where did the organizational framework come from? The settlements before them show no signs of large-scale hierarchy or specialized administrative classes. The sudden emergence of bureaucracy feels more like an imposed order than an organically cultivated one. In Egypt, the precision of stone dressing in the earliest dynastic period is another anomaly. Although mainstream scholars attribute this to rapid mastering of techniques, the archaeological layers do not display the messy learning curve one would expect. Instead, the first large-scale stone blocks are cut with a competence that rivals later achievements. The mistakes that should accompany early experimentation are curiously absent. It is as if the craftsman inherited a method without inheriting the manual traditions that typically preserve such knowledge. Some researchers have attempted to explain these inconsistencies through regional interactions. Knowledge could have diffused between cultures in ways not yet understood. But when comparing the timelines, the supposed transmission routes appear too slow, too tenuous, and too fragmented. Urban planning in the Indus Valley does not resemble that of Sumer. Early Egyptian architecture does not mimic Mesopotamian methods, yet the leaps occur in parallel, as if responding to a shared but inaccessible impetus. Anthropologist Denise Schmant-Besserat proposed that counting tokens used for millennia evolved into writing. But the earliest proto-cuneiform tablets already encode economic, astronomical, and ritual information far beyond what counting tokens can explain. The transition is too smooth, too complete. Likewise, in Egypt, the first hieroglyphs show an integrated system, phonetic signs, determinatives, and symbolic associations, without the clunky intermediates seen in developing scripts. Even Emery, studying pre-dynastic tombs, noted that the earliest inscriptions behave like the remnants of a mature tradition, rather than the beginnings of one. There are scholars who interpret these gaps as evidence of independent cognitive thresholds. Humans, once reaching certain population densities, develop complexity rapidly. But this explanation, while theoretically appealing, does not ease the discomfort of the physical evidence. Complexity leaves traces, failed experiments, half-formed ideas, transitional technologies, yet these are sparse. The earliest layers of complex societies behave too similarly, as though echoing an underlying pattern that preceded them. Perhaps the most unsettling element is the emotional tone of these early structures. Many of the oldest temples and ceremonial complexes convey a sense of reverence for something no longer present. The motifs carved into stone hint at rituals or cosmologies inherited from an age already dim in the minds of their creators. In Mesopotamia, some temples show signs of rebuilding over older structures whose functions have been lost. In Egypt, early shrines seem oriented toward celestial configurations that only make sense if one assumes knowledge of processional movements, knowledge that requires long-term observation, stretching far earlier than the dynastic timeline allows. The question then becomes whether these first civilizations were not inventing but remembering. And if they were remembering, what was the source of that memory? A catastrophe? A mass migration? An event that fractured oral traditions and forced survivors to reconstruct fragments of an older worldview? The archaeological record does not answer directly, but it gestures toward an origin hidden beneath layers of silence. Every structure, every shard, every faint inscription in these oldest layers feels like the residue of an earlier voice, faint but persistent. And if the foundations of civilization carry traces of a missing chapter, what would we see if the silt, the sand, and the carefully curated narratives were lifted away? What shape would the world take if the forgotten contours of that chapter were revealed again? There is a quiet unease in the deepest layers of human settlement, a sense that beneath the grand civilizations we celebrate lies a web of cultures whose stories flicker only briefly before dissolving into silence. These are not the famous kingdoms with kings and monuments, but the subtle, half-remembered societies that thrived long before writing, leaving behind fragments too refined to ignore, yet too incomplete to understand. They sit between prehistory and history like ghosts, visible enough to trouble the narrative, but not solid enough to anchor it, and when one studies them closely they seem less like separate branches of humanity, and more like scattered reminders of a shared origin we're no longer able to recall. In Anatolia, on the windswept plateau where Çatalhöyük stood, a sprawling proto-urban settlement grew without streets, its people climbing through roof openings into intimate rooms decorated with murals and symbolic reliefs. These artworks, leopards, vultures, geometric patterns, suggest a ritual vocabulary rich with meaning, but the meaning remains elusive. No written records survive. No clear lineage connects them to later civilizations. Their world ends abruptly, not through a dramatic catastrophe, but through the slow dimming of a cultural flame. Yet when one examines the symbolic grammar etched into their walls, there is an uncanny sense of continuity, with motifs found later in regions far beyond Anatolia. It is as though their symbols drifted outward, carried by memory long after the city itself was abandoned. Then there are the Ubaid people of southern Mesopotamia, often overshadowed by the later brilliance of Sumer. Their pottery appears standardized, their settlements structured, their artwork surprisingly sophisticated. Figurines with elongated faces and serpentine features have long puzzled scholars, not because they suggest anything fantastical, but because they reflect a symbolic vocabulary that does not align cleanly with later styles. These practices linger across millennia, yet leave no explanation for their origins. The Ubaid did not build ziggurats, did not write texts, did not leave chronicles, but they shaped the landscape upon which the Sumerians later built, and their influence seems too consistent to be accidental. It is as if their traditions served as the faint scaffolding upon which a later civilization reconstructed itself. Farther east, in the Indus region, lies Mehrgarh, a settlement older than Egypt's earliest dynasties and predating the mature Indus cities by thousands of years. Its people pioneered practices, dentistry, beadwork, plant domestication, that appear startlingly advanced for their time. Yet they, too, leave behind no narrative of who they were or where their knowledge came from. The sophistication of their craft work, especially the microscopic precision of drilled beads, suggest long experimentation, but the archaeological layers show little of the trial-and-error process one might expect. Skills appear fully formed, fade, then reappear later in the grand cities of the Indus Valley. How does a technique vanish and then return with such clarity, as though rediscovered from a faint memory rather than invented anew? Across Europe, the Vinca culture carved symbols onto tablets, patterns that some linguists have attempted to compare to proto-writing. Though most scholars hesitate to call them a script, the symbols display a consistency difficult to attribute to coincidence. The Vinca were not city builders. They left no monuments, no armies, no palaces, yet their symbolic traditions sprawled across a vast region for centuries, like a whisper spreading through the forests. The tablets found at Tartaria further complicate the picture. 3 small clay objects inscribed with characters that resemble both Vinca motifs and distant Near Eastern symbols. The dating and context remain debated, but the resonance is unmistakable. It suggests a world in which ideas traveled along routes we have not fully mapped, a network of memory operating beneath the surface of early civilization. Even in East Asia, the Jiahu signs, carved onto tortoise shells millennia before the oracle bones of Shang China, display structural features reminiscent of writing, yet they appear suddenly and vanish just as abruptly, leaving only faint echoes in later script traditions. If these symbols were part of an early communicative system, where is the line that leads from them to the fully developed Chinese writing system? Why does the trail break so cleanly, as if a bridge once stood between them but collapsed before later cultures could cross? When viewed separately, these ancient societies seem like independent experiments in early complexity. But when held together, like pieces of a fractured mirror, they reflect patterns too coherent to dismiss. The sudden disappearances, the symbolic continuities without clear transmission, the advanced practices emerging without long developmental arcs, each hints at something older, something that preceded the timeline we accept. Yet the archaeological record refuses to reveal it plainly. It is as if the earth itself is holding the memory in fragmented form, showing only enough to suggest a forgotten order, but never enough to reconstruct it. Some scholars argue that these patterns reflect parallel cognitive developments. Human minds, reaching similar thresholds of symbolic thought, might independently generate similar motifs, structures, and practices. But even these explanations falter when confronted with specific anomalies, like the uniformity of Vinca symbols across vast distances, or the sophisticated beadwork of Mehrgar appearing with no clear antecedents. Parallel invention is possible, even probable in some cases, but the repetition of sudden sophistication, followed by disappearance, across multiple regions suggests a deeper shared experience, a quiet inheritance carried through generations, fragile enough to vanish but persistent enough to resurface. Perhaps these silent civilizations were not the originators but the lost carriers of an older legacy, as symbols may be the diluted remnants of a more unified symbolic language, passed down through stories, rituals, or objects that did not survive. Their advanced techniques might be the final sparks of knowledge once widely understood, but later fragmented by migrations, climate shifts, or catastrophes that fractured human continuity. What if the world before the rise of Sumer Egypt and the Indus Valley was not empty, but full of interconnected traditions, mythic memories, and techniques inherited from a time now buried so deeply that only shadows remain? The archaeological record may not answer directly, but its silences speak with a peculiar insistence. They hint that the earliest civilizations did not emerge alone but stood upon the fading echoes of predecessors whose names we no longer know. And if these echoes represent only the final ripple of something even older, what would we find if we traced the ripple back to its source? Would we uncover a forgotten chapter of humanity, one that shaped the world 6,000 years ago, yet remains invisible behind the curtain of deep time? Or would we discover that the silence itself is the final clue, pointing toward an origin not lost, but intentionally obscured, waiting for those willing to listen beyond the threshold of recorded history? There is a particular strangeness in the earliest Sumerian texts, a quiet insistence that the world they inherited was not entirely their own. Among all ancient civilizations, the Sumerians are often regarded as the first to write, the first to build cities, the first to map the heavens with deliberate geometry. But their own scribes never claimed such primacy. Instead, they wrote with a tone that feels almost reverential, as though they were custodians of memories far older than their cities, their temples, even their own identity. And nowhere is this more hauntingly clear than in the Sumerian king list. The king list is a text that should not exist in its current form. On the surface, it appears to be a record of rulers, a chronological account of kingship passing from one city-state to another. Yet the earliest sections do not behave like history. They read like a memory of a world half remembered, half myth. Kings ruling for spans measured not in decades but in tens of thousands of years. 5 cities named as though they were legendary capitals. A flood described not as metaphor but as an event marking the boundary between worlds. Scholars interpret these details symbolically, arguing that the exaggerated rains reflect cosmology, not chronology. And perhaps they do. But the persistence of these antediluvian memories, copied across generations, referenced in multiple tablets, and accepted as cultural truth, creates an unsettling question. Why did the Sumerians believe their world was a continuation of something much older, something interrupted? Even more curious is the tone of the text. After describing those impossibly long reigns, the king list transitions seamlessly into the historical kings known from archaeology, as though there were no boundary between mythic and factual time. It is the smoothness of that transition that raises doubts. Myths usually stand apart, given their own spaces, their own ceremonial weight. But here, myth and history share the same ink, the same stone, the same matter-of-fact phrasing. It implies that the Sumerians did not see a distinction. They believed, or at least recorded, that their history restated something older, not invented, remembered. Other tablets echo this sentiment. In creation hymns, humans do not arise from ignorance but are fashioned to restore or maintain lost order. In temple inscriptions, the gods are described not as distant spirits, but as those who restored the rites after the Great Ruin. Even agricultural instructions, seemingly mundane, contain phrases like, "as it was in the time before." This repeated recollection of a before creates an unsettling impression. The Sumerians thought of themselves not as founders, but as inheritors. One of the most debated pieces of evidence comes from Eridu, often called the earliest city. Excavations revealed a sequence of temples stacked one atop another for millennia. Yet the oldest levels, built with simple materials, already exhibit a coherent plan and orientation. No crude experiments, no gradual evolution, just the sudden emergence of a fully conceptualized sacred space. When scholars studied the layout, some noted that the earliest temple seems to replicate a model refined over generations, though the archaeological layers below show no such process. The Sumerians claimed Eridu was founded by the first kings after kingship descended from heaven. But beneath the mythic phrasing lies a quiet implication. Something descended, something arrived, something began again. There are tablets in which Sumerian scribes lament lost knowledge. One speaks of rituals we no longer know, another of days whose number the elders forgot. These laments do not accompany natural disasters or political upheaval. They appear in context suggesting the loss occurred long before the scribes' time, long before any king listed in their records. It is as if even the oldest Sumerians were aware that their cultural memories stretched only as far as a flood or an event they could not describe except through mythic language. Some researchers argue that these texts reflect a psychological need to connect with deep time. Ancient peoples, lacking scientific chronology, may have extended their past symbolically to grant their societies legitimacy or cosmic significance. Yet this explanation feels insufficient when confronted with the material evidence. the abrupt emergence of writing, the fully formed administrative systems, the sophisticated astronomy encoded in early tablets. The earliest stylists demonstrate knowledge that should have required centuries, even millennia, of continuous observation. How did such knowledge appear so suddenly in societies only just learning to use writing? There are clues in the structure of the earliest texts. Proto-cuneiform tablets, dating to around 3200 BCE, contain not just accounting entries but complex ideological symbols. Some represent cosmic order, others celestial cycles, still others rituals whose purposes remain obscure. One tablet describes a sequence of offerings aligned with lunar phases, yet the precision of the alignment suggests astronomical familiarity, far older than the writing system recording it. Could the scribes have inherited astronomical traditions from oral lineages stretching into prehistory? Possibly. But if so, why do the more ancient settlements in Mesopotamia show no clear development of these practices? Why do they appear instead as artifacts without ancestry? Linguists studying Sumerian have long puzzled over its status as a language isolate, one with no known relatives. Some assume that its isolation reflects an ancient migration or a vanished linguistic family. But others propose a more unsettling idea, that Sumerian represents a remnant of a much older linguistic world, one erased before the rise of written history. If the language itself carries memories of a lost era, then the stories recorded in it may not be metaphorical reconstructions, but echoes of events too distant for precise retelling. The flood narrative shared across Mesopotamian cultures is often interpreted as a memory of local river catastrophes. Yet the consistency of its structure, the warning, the arc, the survival of knowledge, the restart of civilization, feel strangely aligned with global mythic patterns. From Egypt's tale of the destruction of mankind to India's story of Manu, to Mesoamerican legends of previous suns, the idea of a world-ending event that wiped away an earlier age transcends geography. It implies either extraordinary coincidence or a shared ancestral memory fragmented by time. When reading the older Sumerian stories, one cannot escape the sense of absence, not the absence of imagination, but the absence of context. The texts behave like late chapters of a book whose beginning is missing. The rituals, symbols, and myths seem to reference something unsaid, something assumed, something once familiar but no longer understood by their own scribes. This quality, the feeling that one is reading the remnants of a story passed down through a long chain of forgetting, creates an eerie resonance. It is as though the Sumerians themselves stood at the edge of the memory, aware of the darkness behind them, but unable to pierce it. What lies in that darkness? A forgotten culture, a period of upheaval so severe that only fragments survived, or merely the natural decay of oral traditions over countless generations. The tablets do not answer, they only hint. And in those hints, one begins to wonder whether the first civilization of history might not have been the first at all, only the first to speak after a long and silent night, whose true beginning remains hidden beneath the sands of deep time. There is a particular stillness in the earliest layers of Egyptian history, a kind of quiet depth that refuses to resolve into clarity. When one descends through the archaeological strata of the Nile Valley, through the shifting sands of pre-dynastic settlements, the early graves, the modest houses of the first farmers, one senses not a linear ascent but a broken thread. Egypt's rise appears sudden, almost theatrical, as though someone pulled back a curtain to reveal a civilization already rehearsed. And yet, beneath the grandeur of its earliest monuments, something older flickers, a memory the Egyptians themselves could not fully articulate. Egypt's own texts hint at this lost memory with a mixture of reverence and distance. In temple inscriptions and mortuary literature, one encounters repeated references to these Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, described as a lineage preceding the earliest kings. The names, if they were historical, are not recorded, their deeds remain vague. But their presence is woven through the mythic fabric of Egypt's identity, appearing in king lists, temple reliefs, and theological texts that allude to a period before the dynasties, before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, before the world as recorded history knew it. Mainstream Egyptology often categorizes the followers of Horus as mythic ancestors or symbolic archetypes representing early chiefs or clans. But some researchers, including earlier scholars like Emery, pointed out the curious consistency with which this group appears in inscriptions. They're not portrayed as gods, nor as ordinary humans. They occupy liminal space, as if they belong to a chapter partially remembered, but already slipping into legend by the time the earliest hieroglyphs were carved. If they were entirely fictional, why do they appear in texts meant to convey political legitimacy, historical continuity, and ritual authority? Why do the earliest kings depict themselves not as innovators, but as restorers of an order established by beings whose identities are already blurred? The architectural layers raise further questions. At Abydos, the earliest royal tombs, those attributed to the so-called dynasty Yamun, appear with levels of craftsmanship that seem out of place for a supposedly emerging society. Some show precision stonework that should not predate the technological experimentation of later dynasties. In Saqqara, the step pyramid of Djoser is celebrated as the first great stone monument in Egypt. Yet beneath its innovative design lies a series of subterranean chambers, passages, and polished limestone blocks whose refinement appears incongruous with the era's supposed architectural infancy. The surrounding complex is even more perplexing. Colonnades, courtyards, ritual enclosures designed with a cohesive symbolic framework already fully mature. Where are the crude precursors, the half-formed experiments, the early failures from which such monumental confidence should have grown? The archaeological strata below do not display the expected gradient. The leap is abrupt, almost vertical. Then there are the enigmatic stone vessels, thousands of them, found in tombs predating the dynastic period. Many are carved from materials harder than the copper tools believed to have been available: diorite, schist, basalt. Their walls are often astonishingly thin, symmetrical, consistent. The skill required to produce them suggests an artisanal tradition far older than the graves in which they appear. Scholars propose that these vessels were prestige objects, perhaps ceremonial. Yet the craftsmanship seems to exceed the technological context of the era. It feels like a remnant, an echo of a skill inherited from artisans who no longer existed when the vessels were placed in the ground. The earliest hieroglyphs present another riddle. They appear suddenly around 3200 BCE in a mature form. Phonetic components, semantic determinatives, and symbolic conventions already in place. Linguists searching for earlier stages of the script encounter only fragmentary motifs that do not convincingly precede the full system. It is as if the script emerged from a tradition that left no paper trail, no developmental arc. This abruptness parallels the sudden appearance of Egyptian religious and cosmological systems. The earliest pyramid texts, carved in the 5th and 6th dynasties, are already dense with theological complexity. Deities, rituals, cosmograms, moral principles, all respond to a worldview that must have taken centuries to mature. Yet the written record begins midstream, as though capturing only the visible surface of a deeper cultural current. Egyptian priests, in their own writings, seemed aware of this. They often describe themselves as caretakers of the words left by the ancestors, yet those ancestors remain unnamed and undefined. In certain temple inscriptions, the priests speak of rituals restored from writings we no longer understand. The implication is troubling. Even in the Old Kingdom, custodians of sacred knowledge were performing acts inherited from a past already lost to them. One of the most intriguing pieces of this puzzle lies in the Palermo stone, a fragmented king list that records not only early dynastic rulers, but also pre-dynastic kings belonging to an era the stone calls the reign of the gods. These rulers, like those in the Sumerian king list, span impossibly long periods. Most Egyptologists interpret this section as symbolic, representing cycles of creation and cosmic order, but the seamless narrative transition from divine rulers to human kings mirrors the structure of the Sumerian text too closely to dismiss entirely. Why did two of the world's earliest recording cultures preserve frameworks that begin with an era of forgotten predecessors? The Egyptians also possessed astronomical knowledge that raises questions about continuity. Early temples align with solstices, equinoxes, and stellar risings requiring long-term observation. The orientation of some sacred sites, such as those in the region of Nekund, suggests familiarity with precessional movement, a cycle requiring observations across thousands of years. How did a civilization at the dawn of writing acquire such awareness? Did they develop it themselves? Or were they continuing a tradition handed down through oral memory long before the first hieroglyph was carved? The idea of an inherited system, fragmented but persistent, becomes more compelling when examining ritual objects, burial customs, and cosmological diagrams. Some early pre-dynastic motifs seem strangely aligned with later symbolic frameworks, even though centuries lie between them. It is as though later Egyptians were reconstructing, piece by piece, a worldview whose full structure had been forgotten, much like assembling a puzzle with missing central pieces. Scholars have long noted Egypt's fixation on restoration, rituals to renew order, festivals to reenact creation, offerings meant to preserve the balance established by unnamed ancestors. This obsession hints at a deeper cultural memory, that the world had once fallen out of balance, and that the responsibility of kings and priests was not to innovate but to repair. But repair what? A forgotten cosmos, a rupture in cultural continuity, a disaster that erased earlier lineages. The records gesture but do not answer. The silence is palpable. The deeper one journeys into Egypt's earliest layers, the more the civilization appears not as the beginning of something, but as the continuation of an older story whose opening chapters have been lost. Their own texts admit this. Their rituals reconstruct this. Their architecture echoes this. Egypt feels less like the first light of dawn, and more like the first sunrise after a long unrecorded night. And if Egypt itself sensed that it was rebuilding from fragments, rebuilding from ruins unseen, what lies beneath those fragments? What presence? What memory, what vanished tradition prompted the oldest civilization to speak so consistently of those who came before, those whose names have vanished into the desert wind? There is a peculiar shiver that runs through the oldest astronomical records, a faint tremor suggesting that the sky remembered something humanity had forgotten. Civilizations that should have been too young, too newly formed, too preoccupied with survival to lift their eyes to the heavens, nevertheless produced alignments and calculations that implied long observation, far longer than their documented histories allow. And when we trace these fragments back across the world following the faint glow of ancient star knowledge, this strange pattern emerges. The sky those early peoples described does not entirely match the sky we know today. The earliest Sumerian star lists, etched into clay during the 3rd millennium BCE, contain structures that appear improbably complete. They categorize constellations, outline lunar months, and delineate celestial pathways in ways that suggest inherited frameworks rather than original invention. Scholars like Otto Neugebauer, who devoted much of his life to studying early astronomical systems, noted that Mesopotamian sky law seemed to arrive already mature, as though the scribes were copying older patterns rather than constructing them anew. The zodiac itself, though formalized later, appears to echo a system that required centuries of uninterrupted observation. How could such systematic knowledge emerge so quickly within the historical record? Egypt offers a similar conundrum. Many temple structures, particularly those of the Old Kingdom, show alignments with solstices, equinoxes, and significant stellar events, including the heliacal rising of Sirius, which became the foundation of the Egyptian calendar. But the precession of the equinoxes, The slow wobble of Earth's axis over a 26,000-year cycle introduces further complexity. Some temple orientations appear to match celestial positions not in the 3rd millennium BCE, but in epochs far earlier. The Dendera zodiac, though created in the Greco-Roman period, preserves symbolic traditions whose roots may stretch back long before dynastic Egypt. Scholars like Shvala de Lubitsch, controversial, contested, but persistent, argued that certain astronomical motifs in Egypt reflect awareness of precessional movement, thousands of years before Greek astronomers formally recognized it. Mainstream Egyptology counters that such claims overreach, that symbolic representation does not equate to scientific understanding, yet the orientations remain, carved into stone with a precision that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Why would the earliest temple builders anchor their rituals to stars whose positions would shift over the centuries unless they were replicating an older pattern? Why would they align sacred sites to astronomical conditions that no longer match the sky of their own era? Then there is Nebta Playa, a Neolithic ritual site deep in the Sahara, built thousands of years before Egypt raised its pyramids. Its stone circle aligns with solstitial points, and some researchers propose that certain alignments reflect a knowledge of precessional change. Though debated fiercely, the site's antiquity alone challenges assumptions about when humans first tracked celestial cycles with such precision. Across the ocean, the ancient peoples of the Americas developed ski traditions equally perplexing. The Maya recorded astronomical cycles with extraordinary accuracy, especially the movements of Venus. The calculations are so precise that they match modern values despite being composed more than a millennium ago. Indigenous Andean cultures, long before the Incas, constructed solar observatories embedded within their settlements, using horizon markers to track seasonal changes. But these systems, too, appear suddenly. Their foundational knowledge seems older than the societies that preserved it. What ties these disparate traditions together is not just their sophistication but their incompleteness. Each system feels like a fragment, a shard of a larger cosmological puzzle. They do not evolve smoothly from simpler earlier forms. They begin in complexity and erode over time. The symbolic richness of early sky lore in Egypt becomes more rigid in later periods. The astronomical precision of early Mesopotamia declines in subsequent centuries. Even in East Asia, where ancient Chinese astronomers meticulously charted the heavens, early records contain echoes of star positions that no longer align with their historical time frame. Some researchers propose that these discrepancies arise from observational errors or later copying mistakes. But when examined collectively, the variations form a pattern too consistent to ignore. The oldest records fit a sky slightly out of sync with ours, as though they were referencing constellations as they appeared in epochs predating the societies that recorded them. One of the most intriguing examples lies in the concept of the world ages, shared across several ancient cultures. In India's Yuga cycles, a Mesopotamian text referencing eras governed by different heavenly configurations, in Greek philosophical traditions describing successive cosmic ages, and in Egyptian iconography hinting at shifts in celestial order, one finds a recurring theme: the notion that time is measured not only in human generations but in cosmic rhythms. Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Dechend, in their controversial yet influential work Hamlet's Mill, argued that myths from around the world encode knowledge of precession. Their ideas remain debated, but the parallels they identified, stories of rotating heavens, shifting poles, celestial ages, suggest at least the possibility that ancient myths memorialize sky conditions not witnessed in recorded history. If true, this raises uncomfortable questions. How does one preserve knowledge of a cycle spanning thousands of years without writing? How does one transmit that knowledge through upheavals, migrations, and environmental shifts? And why does this knowledge appear suddenly in cultures emerging from periods of apparent fragmentation? Some have suggested that survivors of earlier cultural hubs passed down fragments of astronomical frameworks, that were later formalized by early civilizations. If such lineages existed, they would not necessarily leave behind written records. Oral traditions, ritual structures, and symbolic alignments might be their only legacy. The sky itself would become the archive, its movements the script, its cycles the memory. Yet even this explanation falters before certain anomalies. In some traditions, constellations are described in configurations corresponding to positions far older than the societies documenting them. In others, myths reference stars that would not have been visible at the same declination during the documented period. Could these be coincidence, errors, or are they remnants of stories inherited from times when the sky truly did look different? Then there is the more philosophical question. Why were early civilizations so deeply concerned with the heavens to begin with? Their earliest records, myths, temples, and rituals revolve around celestial order. They behaved as though the sky held answers to questions they could no longer articulate. They measured time not in seasons but in cosmic cycles. They inscribed their buildings with orientations that pointed beyond their own lifetimes, toward patterns unfolding over millennia. It is as though they were trying to synchronize themselves with something lost, a cosmic rhythm remembered, but no longer understood. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that the earliest civilizations were not mapping the sky of their own era, but reconstructing the sky of a previous one. If so, then their astronomical systems would appear misaligned not because they were wrong, but because they were remembering. What would it mean if the sky those ancient peoples encoded was the sky of a forgotten age? What would it suggest about their origins, their memories, and the silent centuries preceding recorded history? And how much of our current understanding rests on the assumption that the past began where the written record starts, rather than in the deeper, darker vault of time where the sky itself kept watch, long before words existed to describe it? There is a peculiar quietness in the spaces between the world's earliest writing systems, a silence that feels less like absence and more like erasure. When scholars trace the origins of human script, they expect to find evolution, signs becoming symbols, symbols becoming proto-writing, proto-writing becoming full formal systems. But instead of a smooth curve, they find a fractured landscape of symbols that seem to emerge fully formed, unrelated to each other yet strangely resonant, as if they were scattered fragments from a single source, now lost to time. The story normally begins with Sumer, where proto-cuneiform tablets appear around 3200 BCE. Yet these tablets do not show hesitant first attempts. Their signs, though pictographic, encode administrative systems, temple management, calendrical notations, and possibly even astronomical references. For something called proto, it behaves uncomfortably like a system already tested elsewhere, somewhere beyond the reach of excavation. Danishmand Besserat's groundbreaking work suggested that writing evolved from clay-counting tokens, but even she admitted the leap from tokens to full administrative tablets was abrupt, as if a long conceptual bridge were missing. If writing had grown slowly from simple tallies, where are the messy in-between stages? Where are the experiments that failed? Egypt's hieroglyphs present the same puzzle. They appear at nearly the same time as proto-cuneiform, yet they are not derivative. Their structure, phonetic signs, determinatives, logograms, shows a complexity and coherence that suggests a mature symbolic system, one that could not have developed independently in a single generation or even a single century. The earliest inscriptions from Abydos and Nakarta are not fumbling attempts. They are confident strokes, written by people who seem to understand the power of symbols as if it were already part of their cultural memory. Why then do Egypt and Mesopotamia each begin with scripts that feel like midpoints rather than beginnings? Why do their earliest inscriptions resemble the outcomes of long traditions without leaving behind the traditions themselves? The mystery deepens in the Indus Valley, where a script appears around 2600 BCE. The Indus signs remain undeciphered, but their structure, repetitions, classifiers, positional rules, suggests linguistic content. The system appears suddenly, fully articulated, used in administrative and ritual contexts without visible precursors. Its brevity and standardization make it seem older than the civilization using it. Yet no earlier layers reveal its emergence. It arrives silently, endures for centuries, and vanishes without leaving a trace of its developmental roots. At this point, one might expect to find simpler proto-scripts in the Neolithic layers beneath these civilizations, and indeed, some appear, scattered, enigmatic, haunting. In Europe, the Vinci symbols carved onto pottery and figurines in the 6th and 5th millennia BCE exhibit a consistency that unsettles scholars. Their shapes, crosses, chevrons, combs, ladders, reappear with striking uniformity across an enormous region. Some archaeologists propose they represent ownership marks or simple decorative motifs. But the regularity, the repetition, the structured sequences carved into tablets, found at Turteria defy easy explanation. The symbols behave like writing, yet they predate known writing by thousands of years. In China, the Jiahu signs carved onto tortoise shells around 6600 BCE display recurring patterns, vertical bars, triangles, intersecting lines, anticipating features of much later Chinese script. Most scholars argue the Jiahu signs were mnemonic or ritualistic, not linguistic. But if they were merely marks, why were they carved onto sacred ritual objects and buried with care? And why do their shapes resemble signs found in early oracle script thousands of years later? Across the world, early Mesoamerican cultures such as the Olmec developed symbolic systems that emerge abruptly around 900 BCE. Some of their glyphs resemble later Maya script despite enormous temporal and cultural distances. Again, no clear developmental sequence links the earliest symbols to later full writing systems. These scattered proto-symbol traditions, spanning continents, seem to carry the same whisper. A faint memory of something older, something shared, something now broken. Some scholars dismiss these parallels as coincidence. Humans, after all, tend to draw similar shapes. But when one looks closely, the similarity is not merely visual, they are structural. The symbols appear in sequences, they cluster by function, they repeat with ritual consistency. They behave as though they once formed part of a symbolic system, whose grammar we can no longer see. It raises an unsettling question. Were these early scripts true beginnings, or were they late afterimages of an older, symbolic world erased by time? Symbolic anthropologists have long argued that writing arises from the cognitive need to externalize memory. But what if the need was not to create new memory, but to salvage old memory? Fragments of knowledge inherited from cultures that vanished before the archaeological record grows continuous. Some researchers have dared to suggest that the emergence of writing across the world, within such a narrow time frame, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, reflects not independent invention but independent reconstruction. Each culture may have attempted to revive a symbolic tradition, preserved only in ritual, myth, or fragments of ancient objects. Consider the curious persistence of numerical and geometric motifs across early civilizations. The use of specific ratios repeated across unrelated cultures implies a shared conceptual world. The prevalence of serpent motifs linked to knowledge, of trees symbolizing cosmic order, of gates and thresholds marking sacred transition, all appear embedded within mythic frameworks that feel older than the societies narrating them. What if the earliest writing systems were attempts to capture concepts no longer fully understood? Attempts to preserve memories inherited from a period for which we have no written records. Attempts to write down what had previously been spoken, enacted, or carved into wooden stone now lost. Some tablets hint at this possibility. In Mesopotamia, one early text laments words we no longer remember how to read. In Egypt, priests wrote of rituals restored from the writings of the ancestors. In the Indus Valley, certain recurring sign clusters appear almost formulaic. as though echoing liturgical refrains whose meaning had already begun to fade. And yet, despite these hints, the trail breaks. The proto-symbol traditions do not connect seamlessly to the full writing systems. Instead, they stand like disjointed islands, Vincha, Jiahu, Tertaria, Olmec, each isolated, each enigmatic, each resonant with a kind of intelligence that does not unfold gradually, but appears already formed. It is as if the world lost something, some central symbolic source, before the rise of civilization. And the first writers were not pioneers but salvagers, piecing together shards of a system fragmentarily remembered across generations. The thought is unsettling because it implies a deeper story, one where writing does not begin with Sumer or Egypt, but ends there, as the last echo of a much older symbolic order. If the earliest civilizations were indeed inheritors rather than inventors, then every sign they carved was part of a salvage operation, an attempt to preserve what little remained of a forgotten past. And if that is so, then what vanished before writing emerged? What symbolic world collapsed so completely that only scattered echoes survived? Echoes that reappeared thousands of years later as sudden, inexplicable brilliance. The scripts remain silent, but the silence feels deliberate, as though the missing mother script lies just beyond reach, buried in the shadows of a world 6,000 years gone. There is an ache at the edges of human memory, a faint trembling where history dissolves into prehistory and the mind senses a fracture it cannot quite name. When we peer back beyond the 6,000-year threshold, the timeline does not fade gradually. It drops away, abrupt and hollow, leaving a silence too complete to be natural. Archaeologists speak of transitions and developments, but the deeper we dig, into soil, into symbols, into skeletal remains, the more the past behaves like a shattered vessel, its pieces scattered across continents, none of them fitting neatly into the rest. It is here, in this unsettled terrain, that cognitive archaeology begins to whisper a different story, that humanity may have suffered a catastrophic break in memory itself. The idea seems strange at first. How can memory, collective, cultural, embodied, break? But the archaeological record suggests exactly that. Between 8,000 and 4,000 BCE, human societies across the world experienced a strange oscillation. In some places, symbolic richness flourished. Elaborate burials, ritual architecture, complex iconography. In others, the symbolic world dimmed, shrinking into simpler forms. Cognitive archaeologists like Stephen Mithun and Ian Hodder have long noted this uneven landscape. It is as though humans remembered how to build meaning in some regions while forgetting elsewhere. The rise and fall of symbolic complexity does not follow a smooth evolutionary arc. It stutters, it fades, it resurges, it behaves like memory after trauma. Consider the end of the last glacial period. Between 12,000 and 8,000 BCE, massive climatic fluctuations reshaped the world. Melting ice sheets, rising sea levels, megafaunal extinctions, violent storms, shifting coastlines. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the sea. Some estimates suggest that nearly 20 million square kilometers of habitable land were inundated by melting ice. If human cultures clustered along coastlines, as modern patterns suggest, then many early settlements, symbols, and stories now lie beneath oceans, erased from the archaeological record. What we perceive as a beginning may merely be the remnants of survivors rebuilding their worlds in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. The 8.2-kilo-year event provides further clues. This sudden climatic downturn triggered by massive glacial meltwater destabilizing ocean circulation caused global droughts and dramatic temperature drops. Archaeologists have documented population bottlenecks, abandoned settlements, and cultural simplifications during this period. Symbolic traditions in some regions weaken or disappear entirely. Ritual practices shrink. Artistic expression fades. It is as though humanity withdrew into itself, conserving what little cultural memory remained. Then, centuries later, a new surge of complexity appears. Agriculture stabilizes, social networks expand, monumental architecture reemerges. But this new complexity does not look like a continuation. It behaves like reconstruction. Cognitive scientists propose that cultural systems depend on memory scaffolds, social structures, rituals, teaching mechanisms, and symbolic practices that maintain knowledge across generations. When these scaffolds collapse, through environmental catastrophe, disease, famine, or mass migration, knowledge fragments, skilled crafts vanish, oral traditions slip, symbolic worlds shrink. It is not necessary for everyone to die for memory to break. It is enough for the chains of transmission to fracture. And fracture they did. The archaeological record of early Holocene societies shows repeated instances of skills appearing fully formed, disappearing, and reappearing centuries later with no visible lineage. At Çatalhöyük, artistic and ritual traditions flourish for centuries, then dissipate, replaced by simpler symbolic practices. In the Levant, early agricultural villages develop complex ritual structures, skull cults, plastered ancestors, only for these practices to fade abruptly. In East Asia, certain pottery techniques emerge with stunning sophistication, vanish for generations, then resurface in unrelated regions. These patterns resemble not invention but recollection. Fragments of knowledge resurfacing in different times and places like memories buried deep within the collective psyche. There's also the question of population bottlenecks. Geneticists have identified several during the Holocene, particularly in regions affected by droughts and volcanic eruptions. The eruption of Mount Toba around 74,000 BCE is the most famous, but smaller, later bottlenecks may have erased entire lineages of knowledge carriers, specialists in navigation, astronomy, material craft, or ritual lore whose skills were never passed on. A collapse in population destabilizes memory. So does forced migration. So does the sudden destruction of landscapes that once served as mnemonic anchors. Mountains, rivers, constellations, ancestral sites. Cognitive archaeology shows that memory is spatial. It ties itself to place. When places vanish, memories vanish with them. But something deeper shadows these patterns. The earliest civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, speak of a time before their own, a time they remembered imperfectly. Their texts describe lost rituals, forgotten gods, ancient catastrophes that reset the world. They hint at a cultural amnesia lingering at the dawn of history. The Sumerians wrote of days whose count has been lost. Egyptian priests spoke of rites restored from writings we no longer understand. Even early Chinese records refer to bygone ages ruled by sage kings whose knowledge was obscured by the flood. These are not mythic embellishments. They read like laments. The cognitive break becomes even more pronounced when examining symbolic systems. The earliest languages, Sumerian, early Egyptian, early Chinese, appear abruptly and fully formed, as if reviving frameworks that had once existed in oral or symbolic form, but whose origins were already fading. Mythologists have long noted how stories from distant cultures share uncanny structural similarities. Flood myths, golden ages, civilizations erased, knowledge lost, the world rebuilt from fragments. These are not just stories, they are metaphors for cultural memory itself. And then there is the neurological question. Anthropologists studying trauma have found that collective trauma can disrupt narrative cohesion, leading cultures to compress, distort, or entirely omit certain events. The abruptness with which early civilizations transitioned from prehistory to history reflects a similar pattern, an abrupt narrowing of memory, followed by the sudden construction of orderly narratives to fill the void. Why do so many ancient cultures begin their histories with divine rulers or mythical beings? Perhaps because the true origins were already lost, and myth was the only language left to bridge the silence. The most unsettling possibility is that the break was not gradual but sudden, triggered by a catastrophe so disruptive that it severed humanity's connection to its own past. The 5.9-kiloyear event. The dramatic drying of the Sahara, the collapse of Neolithic settlements, the dispersal of populations, occurred just before the rise of civilization. It is tempting to imagine that this event acted as a reset, scattering the remnants of earlier symbolic worlds and forcing survivors to rebuild from memory. But memory is imperfect. It fractures, it fades, it leaves behind echoes that civilizations later reinterpret as myth. If writing, architecture, astronomy, metallurgy, and ritual complexity all re-emerged around the same time, perhaps it was not because humanity suddenly invented them, but because it suddenly remembered. And if that is true, then what lies beneath the surface of our earliest myths? What forgotten world hides behind humanity's oldest memories? What event was powerful enough to break the continuity of human thought and force the species to begin again, carrying only fragments of a knowledge system too ancient to trace? The silence at the heart of our deep past does not feel empty. It feels wounded. There is a moment in the archaeological record, quiet, abrupt, unsettling, when the world seems to contract. Landscapes that once supported thriving communities dry into deserts. Rivers shift, abandoning the settlements built in their embrace. Populations that once scattered across continents begin to cluster in shrinking pockets of survivable land. This moment, occurring around 4000 BCE, is known in geology as the 5.9-kiloyear event, a climatic downturn so sudden and far-reaching that its shadow stretches across the earliest chapters of civilization. And yet, despite its significance, it rarely appears in the popular telling of human origins. The silence surrounding it feels too heavy to be accidental, as though the event marks not just a climatic shift, but a civilizational boundary, a threshold between the world that was and the world reconstructed afterward. The geological evidence is stark. Across North Africa, the once green Sahara, home to rivers, lakes, and the sprawling megafauna-rich plains, began its transformation into the desert we know today. Cave paintings and petroglyphs from the central Sahara show scenes of pastoral life, cattle herding, fishing, swimming. These images are not speculative. They depict a world that truly existed. But around the time of the 5.9-kiloyear event, those lakes began to disappear. Vegetation vanished. People abandoned settlements that had existed for millennia. Some migrated north into the Nile Valley, others east toward Mesopotamia, still others south into sub-Saharan regions. The dispersal was not gentle, it was forced, driven by environmental collapse so swift that it left cultural traditions fractured and scattered across continents, like shards of a broken vessel. In Mesopotamia, the same pattern emerges. The climate shift brought increasing aridity, pushing communities toward the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, compressing populations into denser and more competitive landscapes. Some archaeologists argue that this compression catalyzed urbanization, but the archaeology reveals something more ambiguous. Settlements abandoned abruptly, material culture simplified, symbolic traditions interrupted. It is as if a long-established world unraveled, leaving survivors to rebuild social structures under pressure. Out of this compression, cities like Uruk would rise, but their sudden sophistication may not reflect invention so much as reconstruction, the stitching together of memories preserved through upheaval. In the Nile Valley, the climate shift transformed the surrounding deserts into an impenetrable barrier, funneling populations into the thin green corridor along the river. This convergence is often credited with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, but it also produced a rupture, a break in the continuity of earlier traditions. Pre-dynastic cultures like Padarian and Naqada show distinct identities that begin to blur in the centuries following the climatic collapse. The symbolic worlds they once maintained fade or merge, making room for a new ideological framework that would later become dynastic Egypt. But the speed of this transition is troubling. Cultural synthesis on such a scale usually takes centuries of interaction, yet the archaeological layers show a rapid coalescence, as though multiple fragmentary traditions were being reassembled into a cohesive whole. The Indus Valley experienced its own transformations, although the region's major urban centers would not rise until later. Earlier agricultural settlements faced climatic stress as monsoon patterns shifted. Rivers changed course, floodplains expanded and contracted unpredictably. Some scholars propose that these fluctuations set the stage for the uniformity that later characterized Harappan civilization: the standardized bricks, the centralized planning, the meticulous water management. But uniformity does not emerge from experimentation. It emerges from templates, from inherited structures, from older frameworks remembered and imposed on new landscapes. Could it be that the 5.9 kilo-year event acted not as the catalyst for invention, but as the trigger for memory, forcing scattered populations to recall imperfectly the systems they had known before the climatic collapse? The idea is not as speculative as it seems. Genetic studies indicate migrations and population mixing during this era that could have carried cultural memories across vast distances. Oral traditions often preserve traces of environmental disasters, and many mythic cycles describe golden ages followed by periods of chaos, drought, or flood. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian flood myth may echo not only river catastrophes, but also generational recollections of climatic disruption. In Egypt, the concept of restoring Mayat, cosmic balance, may reflect attempts to reclaim a world destabilized by environmental upheaval. In India, early Hindu texts reference cycles of destruction and recreation that feel eerily aligned with climatic shifts. The more one studies the cultural landscape emerging from the 5.9 kilo-year event, the less it resembles an origin point and the more it resembles a reset. The sudden appearance of cities, writing, astronomy, and monumental architecture around this period begins to look strangely coordinated, as if humanity reached back into a dim, fragmented memory for templates of order. The administrative systems of early Mesopotamia, the symbolic complexity of early Egypt, the urban planning of the Indus Valley, these do not resemble the hesitant beginnings of experimentation. They resemble the attempts of cultures emerging from chaos to reconstruct what they could from inherited traditions whose full shape had been lost. This reconstructed order, however, carries the scars of forgetting. Writing systems appear abruptly but incompletely, as they revived from oral or symbolic precursors no longer remembered. Cosmologies reference earlier ages but cannot describe them clearly. Rituals contain gestures whose original meanings are already fading. Even the earliest legal codes behave like restorations, not inventions, efforts to formalize equilibrium in societies destabilized by deep environmental trauma. Could this be why nearly every early civilization insists that its knowledge came from before? Why Sumerians speak of antediluvian kings? Why Egyptians refer to ancestors whose rites they only partially understood? Why the Indus Valley left behind symbols that feel like fragments of a script older than the cities they built? If the 5.9 kilo-year event was indeed a reset, a rupture severing the continuity of human memory, then the sudden rise of civilizations around 4000–3000 BCE may reflect not the dawn of order, but its reconstruction from salvaged pieces. The world that followed was not starting anew, it was trying to remember. But memory, when fractured, does not preserve its shape. It bends, it distorts, it clings to fragments while losing the whole. And so early civilizations built temples aligned to stars whose positions no longer matched their own epoch. They carved rituals whose original purposes had dimmed. They wrote texts referencing ages they themselves did not fully comprehend. They became curators of a past they could not fully explain. Perhaps the greatest irony is that modern scholarship, believing the rupture to be a beginning, interprets the sudden brilliance of early civilizations as spontaneous. But what if it was the opposite? What if the brilliance is the final flickering glow of an older light, one nearly extinguished by environmental collapse? If so, then the real question is not how civilization began, but what it was trying so hard to remember. And why the traces of that earlier world remain so faint, dissolved into myths, symbols, alignments, and unexplained leaps seen across the earliest layers of history. What world existed before the reset, and why did the Earth itself seem to close its memory around it? There is a peculiar tension in the earth beneath our feet, as if the soil itself remembers more than it is willing to reveal. Archaeology, for all its precision and discipline, depends on what survives. Yet survival is uneven, biased, and cruel. Some materials vanish, others endure. Some layers remain intact, others are folded, overturned, or swallowed by time. And in the oldest strata, those closest to the 6,000-year threshold, there are places where the earth seems to hesitate, offering hints without revealing the full shape of the past. These are the forbidden layers, not forbidden by law or institution, but by the inherent fragility of the archaeological record, where anomalies flicker like static in a forgotten transmission. Göbekli Tepe is perhaps the most striking example. Discovered on a windswept hill in southeastern Turkey, its megalithic enclosures date to nearly 10,000 BCE, long before agriculture, metallurgy, cities, or organized religion as we define them. The pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, are carved with animals, abstract symbols, and occasional human forms rendered with surprising anatomical sensitivity. Scholars cautiously frame the site as a ritual complex built by hunter-gatherers, but the magnitude of its architecture strains that explanation. Hunter-gatherer societies can be complex, even ritualistically sophisticated. Yet there is something disquieting about Göbekli Tepe's precision. The scale of labor required implies coordination beyond what small mobile groups normally sustain. And the decision to bury the site intentionally, carefully, deliberately, as if sealing away a memory, invites questions that archaeology cannot comfortably resolve. Its age alone disrupts the traditional narrative. If monumental architecture existed before agriculture, what other traditions, symbolic systems, or forms of knowledge might have existed before writing? Why does Göbekli Tepe appear fully formed in its earliest layers without evidence of a developmental phase? And why does it vanish as abruptly as it appears, as though its builders chose to erase themselves from the unfolding story of human civilization? Other sites complicate the picture further. Nupta Playa, deep in what is now the Sahara, contains a megalithic stone circle aligned with solstices, dating to the 6th millennium BCE. Some researchers argue that its astronomical configuration suggests knowledge of precessional movement. Though this interpretation remains debated, the site's ritual complexity is undeniable. Cattle burials, ceremonial markers, and imported stone suggest a symbolic regime that disappeared long before Egypt's first dynasties emerged. If Nupta Playa was part of the world that memory later forgot, its remnants lie scattered in the desert like broken lines from a Purim whose language we no longer speak. Then there are the enigmatic stone boxes of the Serapeum in Saqqara. Constructed from massive blocks of granite and basalt, polished to near perfection, they weigh dozens of tons each. The precision of their internal surfaces has led to countless debates. Egyptologists maintain they were sarcophagi for Opus bulls, and this interpretation fits the later context of the site. But the craftsmanship displayed in their construction is startling, especially given the tools available during the earliest phases of Egypt's Old Kingdom. Copper chisels and stone hammers cannot easily account for the mirrored surfaces and tight tolerances. Some suggest lost techniques. Others propose long-forgotten traditions of stoneworking. The Serapeum boxes do not violate archaeological principles. They are dated, contextualized, understood in broad strokes. But they hover at the edge of plausibility, like artifacts built using knowledge whose lineage was already fading. Jericho offers another kind of anomaly. Its earliest layers reveal a massive stone tower and defensive wall dating to around 8000 BCE, long before such monumental structures should exist in sedentary settlements. The tower's purpose remains unclear. Astronomical marker, communal symbol, defensive structure. Whatever it was, it stands at odds with the simplicity expected of Neolithic societies. And yet, after thousands of years of occupation, Jericho's symbolic and architectural traditions do not develop smoothly from this point. They fragment, shift, and reappear in forms that suggest cultural discontinuity rather than progression. Even in Europe, sites like the ancient temple complex at Malta complicate the story. The megalithic structures, with their concentric rooms, curved walls, and astronomical alignments, date back to around 3600 BCE. Their sophistication rivals that of much later civilizations. And yet the people who built them left no writing, no clear artistic lineage, no easily traceable origins. When the Maltese temple tradition ends, it ends abruptly, leaving behind an architectural grammar unmatched in the region for millennia. In the Indus Valley, anomalous radiocarbon dates occasionally emerge from sites long associated with the Bronze Age. Hearths, tool fragments, and carbonized remains sometimes yield dates that appear much older than the civilization's accepted timeline. Archaeologists often attribute these to contamination or stratigraphic mixing, reasonable explanations, but the frequency of such anomalies raises an uncomfortable possibility that beneath the Indus Valley civilization lies a deeper, poorly understood cultural horizon. The uniformity of Harappan brickwork, drainage systems, and urban planning has long puzzled researchers. Uniformity suggests centralization or long-standing tradition. But if a tradition exists, where is its developmental trail? Some artifacts complicate these questions further. The Klerksdorp spheres from South Africa, for example, small polished objects found in Precambrian rock formations, have been the subject of speculation and debate. Most geologists attribute their shape to natural processes, but their symmetry and layered structure invite fascination not because they are necessarily artificial, but because they resemble objects whose function, if natural, remains poorly understood. They are reminders that not all anomalies carry meaning, yet their very presence challenges the neatness of our historical frameworks. The Piri race map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, incorporates data from earlier sources that the cartographer himself claimed were ancient. Its depiction of certain coastlines, most famously Antarctica, has led to speculation, though modern scholars argue these interpretations stem from misreadings. Still, the map's compilation from older charts hints at geographic knowledge circulating long before many assume such precision existed. Even if the map itself holds no ancient secrets, it gestures toward a hidden genealogy of cartographic tradition. All of these examples, Göbekli Tepe, Nubta Playa, Jericho, Malta, the Indus anomalies, are not evidence of lost civilizations in the speculative sense. They are evidence of lost continuity, a chain of cultural transmission once stretched across time, and the segments we find today are uneven, broken, out of sequence. The Earth did not preserve the whole story. It preserved only fragments. And perhaps this is the true meaning of forbidden layers, not that they are intentionally hidden, but that they belong to worlds disrupted by environmental catastrophe, migration, and the collapse of memory scaffolds. The anomalies are not outliers. They are ruins of a story too fragile to survive. What remains unclear is whether these fragments belong to a single cultural lineage or to many separate traditions responding to similar pressures. Were they echoes of a forgotten symbolic order? Or were they simply the last glimmers of regional traditions extinguished by the upheavals of the early Holocene? The Earth does not answer. It reveals only enough to provoke the question. And perhaps that question is the point. For every anomalous layer hints at a world that existed before the reset. A world with its own knowledge, its own symbols, its own ways of understanding the sky and the land. A world erased not by conspiracy but by time, climate, and the fragility of memory. And if these fragments are all that remain, what else lies buried deeper still, waiting in the dark for the moment when the earth shifts just enough to expose another forbidden layer, urging us to reconsider everything we thought we knew? There's a strange familiarity in the earliest feats of engineering, as though the people who carved, lifted, aligned, and assembled the first great structures of civilization were not discovering what stone could do, but remembering. The ruins they left behind bear the marks of confidence rather than experiment, precision rather than improvisation. And when we examine these earliest achievements, stonework, metallurgy, monumental planning, we confront the unsettling possibility that the builders were following patterns older than their own cultures, patterns whose origins they themselves may have only dimly understood. The most striking examples lie in the earliest phases of Egyptian stoneworking. Long before the pyramids, in the pre-dynastic period, we find stone vessels carved from diorite, schist, and basalt, materials harder than the copper chisels available at the time. Many of these vessels possess impossibly thin walls, uniform curves, and polished interiors that suggest techniques far more advanced than the tools that archaeology attributes to the era. Some scholars propose that the vessels were crafted over many generations, the result of steady improvement across centuries. But the archaeological layers do not show such gradual refinement. Instead, these stone vessels appear at a level of sophistication that seems to have no ancestry. It is as though the artisans already knew how to work stone in ways that their descendants would later struggle to match. The same is true of early masonry. The foundational layers at sites like Saqqara, Abydos, and Elephantine show precision cuts, tight joins, and surfaces smoothed with uncanny accuracy. Later dynasties, despite their technological advances, often produced rougher work. This reversal, a decline from precision to crudeness, contradicts the expected historical trajectory. Why would the earliest builders produce work that outshines that of the more technologically equipped periods that followed? Did they inherit techniques whose conceptual basis they could not fully transmit? In Mesopotamia, the picture is different but no less puzzling. The first monumental structures, ziggurats, temple complexes, administrative buildings, appear as organized constructions requiring advanced knowledge of materials, load distribution, and long-term durability. Yet the mud brick used in these buildings was produced at a scale that implies industrial coordination. To make millions of bricks with consistent dimensions and composition requires established systems of measurement and planning. But those systems appear abruptly, without the accumulation of prototypes one might expect from a society discovering large-scale building for the first time. Even more intriguing is the wheel. The earliest known wheel appears in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, fully functional and remarkably well-designed. It emerges not as a primitive disc, but as a composite wheel with fitted joints and structural reinforcement. The leap from dragging loads to engineering such a wheel is enormous. Yet the artifact appears without the transitional prototypes that typically mark technological evolution. It is as though the concept of the wheel arrived fully formed, a memory crystallized into wood. In the Indus Valley, engineering anomalies deepen the mystery. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were laid out with astonishing consistency. Streets aligned on cardinal axes, drainage systems running beneath paved walkways, standardized bricks produced in precise ratios. This uniformity implies central planning, but the civilization spans an area larger than Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. How could such a vast network maintain identical standards without a centralized authority or written laws describing the required procedures? And yet all indications suggested to centralized social structure with no evidence of palaces, tombs, or elite residences. It is as though the architectural and engineering principles belonged not to a ruling class but to a cultural memory shared across the entire society. Metalwork provides another thread in this web of anomaly. The earliest copper tools, appearing in the 4th millennium BCE, display purity levels that suggest knowledge of smelting techniques more advanced than those of the periods that followed. In some cases, early copper artifacts contain deliberate alloy compositions, arsenical copper, for example, suggesting experimentation or inherited recipes. And yet these early techniques often disappear, replaced by cruder alloys before the rediscovery of more advanced metallurgy centuries later. The oscillation between sophistication and simplicity does not follow the expected pattern of technological progress. It suggests cycles of remembering and forgetting. There are even stranger hints. In some archaeological contexts, stone blocks feature drill holes so clean and symmetrical that modern machinists once doubted their antiquity. Spiral tool marks appear on surfaces where copper tooling should not have produced such precision. These observations do not imply impossible technologies. They imply techniques that do not fit neatly into our models of early craftsmanship. Techniques that may have been inherited from traditions older than the societies practicing them. One could argue that these anomalies reflect nothing more than incomplete archaeological discovery. Yet the pattern is global. In South America, at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo, stone blocks weighing dozens of tons fit together with uncanny precision, their interlocking shapes resembling puzzles rather than walls. The Inca themselves claim the structures were built by earlier peoples. In Easter Island, the earliest mawaya, the largest and most refined, with later statues showing cruder workmanship, a decline rather than an ascent. In Malta, the megalithic temples exhibit architectural sophistication unmatched by later cultures on the island. Everywhere one looks, the earliest phases of monumental construction appear to be the most technically advanced. Such patterns raise an unsettling question. Why do so many early civilizations begin with the highest level of their craftsmanship? Why does progress seem to run backward in the archaeological layers? Why does the earliest brilliance dim over time, only to reappear centuries later in unrelated cultures as though revived from buried memory? Anthropologists sometimes describe a phenomenon called cultural inheritance without lineage. Cases where a community preserves techniques long after the original conceptual basis has been forgotten. The actions survive, but the understanding fades. Rituals persist even when their meanings are lost. Techniques endure even when their origins disappear. Could this explain the anomalies? Could the early engineers of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley have been enacting traditions rooted in a world that no longer existed? A world their ancestors remembered dimly? If so, then the earliest monumental builders were not pioneers but the last flickering inheritors of an older architectural grammar, a grammar perhaps developed over millennia, erased by climatic catastrophes and population upheavals, leaving behind only fragments encoded in ritual, myth, and habit. This interpretation, while not claiming lost civilizations in the fantastical sense, proposes something equally haunting, that humanity did not begin at the dawn of writing, but began again, and that the earliest civilizations were not stepping forward into new knowledge but gazing backward, trying to salvage what they could from a memory too shattered to hold its original shape. It is here, in the strange glow of this inherited brilliance, that the question sharpens. If the first engineers were reconstructing ideas older than their own societies, then who were the original architects? What world forged the knowledge that later emerged in fragmented form? And how much of that world remains buried, not in the soil, but in the unconscious habits of a species trying to rebuild itself after forgetting what it once knew? There is a shadow lingering behind the earliest records of civilization, a presence defined not by what is written, but by what is missing. When one traces the earliest forms of power, scribal authority, priesthoods, temple bureaucracies, one begins to sense that these institutions inherited more than they understood. They became custodians of memory at a time when memory itself was already fractured. And as their influence grew, they did not merely preserve knowledge. They curated it. They edited it. They decided what was worthy of copying and what would quietly dissolve into the silence of forgotten ages. This is the empire of silence. Not political force, but an intellectual one, shaping the boundaries of human history long before modern scholars attempted to reconstruct it. In Mesopotamia, the first scribal schools emerged as guardians of ritual, law, and astronomical tradition. Yet the earliest tablets from these schools already contain references to texts considered ancient, even in their own time. Some catalogs mention works whose titles survive, but whose contents vanished before the first dynasties. One tablet laments the loss of older hymns that could no longer be recited correctly. Another describes rituals restored from fragments. The tone is not triumphant, it is mournful. The scribes knew they were inheriting a damaged archive, and yet their task was to create coherence, to impose order on a narrative that no longer had a continuous thread. The same pattern appears in Egypt. The priesthoods of Heliopolis, Memphis, and Thebes each developed cosmogonies that reflected fragments of a larger mythic tapestry. Yet none of these cosmogonies match perfectly. Each preserves pieces of something older, something once whole, but later broken. The priests themselves acknowledged this. In inscriptions from the New Kingdom, some describe consulting writings from antiquity whose symbols are no longer understood. Others mention rituals restored from the words left by those who came before. This language does not describe invention, it describes recovery. One of the most haunting examples is the so-called House of Life, a scriptorium attached to major temples. Here, priests copied texts deemed sacred, medical treatises, astronomical tables, magical formulas, funerary literature. But the selection of what to copy determined what survived. Texts that lost ritual relevance was simply abandoned. Over generations, this winnowing process created the illusion of continuity, even though entire genres of knowledge may have disappeared. The priests preserved what still felt meaningful, but allowed to die what no longer fit the world emerging after the climactic resets of earlier millennia. China presents a parallel phenomenon. The early Zhou dynasty speaks of the lost writings of the sages, texts said to have belonged to earlier dynasties but destroyed or scattered during periods of turmoil. The classics, revered as ancient foundations of Chinese civilization, were compiled long after their supposed origin dates. Confucius himself is described as collecting fragments of older traditions, editing them, weaving them into coherent volumes. Whether or not the stories are literal, their meaning is unmistakable. The earliest textual authorities were reconstructors, not originators. The Harappans left behind a script that remains undeciphered, but perhaps the more significant absence is the lack of text at all. Their urban planning suggests administrative complexity. Their standardized weights and measures imply bureaucratic oversight. Yet we find no archives, no libraries, no central repositories of knowledge. It is possible that their writings were kept on perishable materials, wood, palm leaves, leather, lost to time. If so, the silence surrounding the Indus Valley is not natural. It is curated by destruction, corrosion, and absence. When archaeologists examine the temples, archives, and administrative centers that did survive, they notice something else: deliberate erasure. In Mesopotamia, royal inscriptions sometimes mention the destruction of old records to legitimate new dynasties. In Egypt, certain kings erased the names of predecessors to rewrite history in their own image. The Amarna period saw the systematic removal of Amun's name from temples. Later, kings attempted to erase Akhenaten himself, and yet beneath these political motives lies something deeper, an acknowledgement that controlling the written past meant controlling the perceived continuity of civilization itself. As civilizations matured, the institutions managing knowledge grew more centralized. Libraries and scriptoria became the gatekeepers of collective memory. But these institutions were fragile. Fires, floods, conquest, and neglect destroyed untold volumes. The library of Ashurbanipal, the most famous of the ancient world, survived only because the clay tablets could endure fire. Other libraries, storing knowledge on papyrus or parchment, left ashes and silence. The great libraries of Alexandria, Memphis, and Heliopolis vanished. The Mayan codices were burned. Early Chinese texts were purged. Indian manuscripts decayed in monsoon climates. Everywhere the pattern holds, vast repositories of knowledge lost, leaving only fragments preserved by chance or ritual significance. This is the empire of silence, not a conspiracy, but a consequence of structure. When the ability to write rests with a small elite, the survival of memory becomes precarious. What they choose to copy lives. What they neglect dies. What they cannot understand fades. What they deem improper or dangerous disappears without a trace. Even in societies without writing, silence reigns. Oral cultures rely on generational continuity. When climate shifts, epidemics, migrations, or wars disrupt those chains, entire symbolic systems collapse. Rituals lose context. Stories become myth. Myth becomes superstition. And superstition eventually dissolves. These communities leave behind only shards, enigmatic carvings, half-understood symbols, unexplained structures that feel older than their builders. What makes this silence unsettling is the possibility that humanity did not simply lose stories, it lost entire frameworks of knowledge. Cosmological systems, architectural grammars, ritual sciences, techniques passed through apprenticeships that could not survive population bottlenecks or climatic upheaval. When the first civilizations revived writing, astronomy, and monumental architecture, they may have been working from fragments, attempting to piece together a shattered world using whatever memories had survived the long dark centuries preceding the rise of recorded history. The earliest texts themselves often acknowledge this. Myths of lost ages, floods that erased earlier worlds, golden eras cut short, gods withdrawing knowledge from humanity. These stories are not merely metaphors, they are expressions of collective memory grappling with rupture. And yet, modern histories often treat the rise of civilizations as a beginning, the temples of Sumer, the pyramids of Egypt, the planned cities of the Indus Valley, the oracle bones of China, the monumental calendars of early Mesoamerica. But what if these were not beginnings? What if they were salvage operations? What if the great builders, astronomers, and priest scholars of early civilizations were trying to reconstruct a world whose full dimensions lay beyond their reach? In this light, the empire of silence becomes not an enemy, but a landscape, an immense dark terrain surrounding the islands of preserved memory. Every library that burned widened the darkness. Every ritual forgotten deepened the void. Every unrecorded tradition vanished into that silence, leaving behind only symbols, objects, and alignments that later cultures could only interpret in fragments. The more we study the earliest civilizations, the more their texts and monuments appear to reflect not the rise of new knowledge, but the echo of something older, a memory scattered across continents, preserved imperfectly, curated by elites who themselves stood on the edge of forgetting. And if the first civilizations inherited only the remnants, what then lies beneath those remnants? What knowledge dissolved before writing existed? What traditions vanished when the climate turned? What worlds were erased when the earth remade itself 6,000 years ago? The silence does not answer, but its weight suggests that the history we know may be only the final chapter of a much older and hidden story, one whose earlier pages were swallowed long ago by the empire of silence. There is a peculiar resonance running through the world's oldest myths, as if stories born thousands of miles apart were remembering the same dream, the same wound, the same forgotten dawn. When scholars of comparative mythology place these traditions side by side, Sumerian king lists, Egyptian Zep-Tepi, India's Yuga cycles, China's age of sage kings, the Greek succession of cosmic ages, they find patterns too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. These cultures did not know each other. They did not trade stories. Their landscapes, languages, and gods were utterly different. And yet, when they spoke of the beginning of civilization, they all described something that came before them. Something luminous, something destroyed, something that ended so completely that the world had to begin again. In Sumer, the world before the flood was ruled by antediluvian kings, whose reigns stretched across impossible spans of time. Then the flood swept over, the tablet reads, and after the flood had swept over, kingship descended again. It is not the exaggeration that captures attention, but the structure, an older order, a catastrophe, a new beginning. The Sumerians did not claim to be the first. They claimed to be the inheritors of a world already ancient when their cities rose. Egypt's version is different, yet unmistakably parallel. Their king lists begin not with Narmer or the earliest dynasts, but with a period called Zep-Tepi, the first time when gods ruled the earth, when sacred knowledge flowed freely, when order and balance were established. Later priests describe Zep-Tepi with reverence, yet they admitted that its rituals were already forgotten in their own time. The early pharaohs saw themselves not as innovators, but as restorers of that primordial order. But what exactly had been lost? And why speak of a first time, unless the time that followed was a second? India's Yuga cycles tell an even broader tale. According to ancient Hindu cosmology, human history is not a single progression, but a succession of ages, Krita, Treta, Dvapara, Kali, each reflecting a decline in virtue, knowledge, and cosmic alignment. The earliest age, Krita Yuga, describes a world of harmony, advanced understanding, and long life. But that world ended, replaced by ages increasingly fractured, fragmented, and filled with forgetting. While these cycles are symbolic, they reflect a collective intuition that humanity once existed in a more complete state, one now irretrievably lost. China preserves its own version. Long before the rise of the Shang dynasty, legends speak of sage kings, Fuxi, Shennong, Huangdi, who brought writing, agriculture, medicine, and order to a world recovering from chaos. These figures are not gods, yet they occupy a mythic space. Their teachings feel like restorations rather than inventions, and the Chinese historical consciousness, deep, cyclical, meticulous, never claims spontaneous origins. It claims continuity with an era the historical record no longer reaches. Even Greece, so often romanticized as the birthplace of reason, frames its earliest ages as echoes of a lost perfection. Hesiod's Works and Days describes the Golden Age, a time of peace and abundance, followed by Silver, Bronze, and Iron Ages, each marked by decline. Plato, writing in Timaeus and Critias, refers to cycles of destruction, to civilizations wiped out and reborn, to knowledge preserved only in fragments passed down by priests who remembered the shape of earlier worlds. Why do these myths align? Why do cultures separated by oceans and millennia describe the same arc, an ancient order, a rupture, a rebirth? Mythologists often argue that calamities such as floods, volcanic eruptions, or climate collapses inspired these narratives. But the consistency of structure suggests something deeper, not merely a shared response to disaster, but a shared memory of a world that preceded known history. Archaeology itself whispers in the same direction. The sudden appearance of writing, architecture, astronomy, and statecraft around 4000 to 3000 BCE feels less like invention and more like restoration. The world's earliest civilizations appear not as naive beginners, but as heirs to fragments they could no longer fully understand. One cannot help but see the parallels. The Sumerians insisted their knowledge came from antediluvian sages. Egyptians claim their rituals restored the order of Zep-Tepi. Indian texts describe sages preserving wisdom through the cyclical destruction of worlds. Chinese myths speak of knowledge-bearing ancestors emerging after chaos. Greek traditions lament a fallen age remembered only in poetic fragments. If these stories emerged independently, why do they trace the same structure of remembering and forgetting? Why do they all describe earlier ages with precision and later ages with uncertainty? Why do they all insist that civilization had a precedent, one erased? The question becomes sharper when considering specific motifs. Floods appear in nearly every mythology, from Mesopotamia and Egypt to China, Mesoamerica, and Oceania. So do cosmic realignments, golden ages, and cycles of loss and renewal. Myths do not usually parallel each other so closely unless they speak to shared human experiences rooted not in imagination but memory. Some anthropologists argue that these myths encode memories of the early Holocene, the melting of glaciers, the inundation of coastlines, the disappearance of fertile plains now submerged beneath the sea. The trauma of losing entire homelands could easily crystallize into stories of lost ages. But the precision of cultural memory, the insistence that knowledge existed before the catastrophe, is harder to attribute solely to environmental change. One might ask whether the earliest civilizations were closer to these memories than we are. They lived in the immediate aftermath of the 5.9 kilo-year event, the climatic chaos that reshaped landscapes and scattered communities. Their oral traditions may still have preserved echoes of a previous symbolic world, a world that collapsed, leaving only fragments to be revived in new forms. Perhaps the myths are not describing supernatural ages, but real periods of cultural richness erased by environmental upheaval. Perhaps Zep Tepi, Krita Yuga, the antediluvian kings, the sage kings, the Golden Age, and countless similar traditions all remember the same forgotten horizon. A symbolic, ritualistic, astronomical world of pre-Neolithic societies whose cultural scaffolds collapsed under climatic pressure. If that is true, then myths do not distort history. They preserve it, blurred by time but consistent in structure. They tell of an age where knowledge was whole, where symbolic systems flourished, where humanity's relationship with the sky, the land, and the sacred was intact. And they tell of a rupture so complete that civilization had to be rebuilt from fragments scattered across the world. What makes this possibility unnerving is not that a lost civilization may have existed, but that the memory of such a world may have survived in mythic form across nearly every ancient society. Myths, then, become the final archive of a world archaeology cannot yet reconstruct, a world dissolved by climate, migration, and the quiet erosion of memory. And if these stories are fragments of the same forgotten order, then the deeper question is no longer whether such an age existed, but why it disappeared so completely. Was it undone by natural catastrophe alone? Or did something else, something more elusive, more complex, play a part in the erasure of that earlier world? There is an unsettling stillness in the way history is constructed, an almost architectural quality to the narratives we are taught. We imagine history as a staircase, each step carved neatly from the one before it, ascending with orderly progression from the primitive to the modern. But when one looks closely, the staircase dissolves. The lines blur, entire steps vanish. Strange plateaus emerge where progress seems to leap rather than grow. And in place of smooth continuity, we find the careful handiwork of generations of scholars, empires, clergy, and institutions shaping the story to fit the world they believed should exist. The further back we look, toward the hazy threshold 6,000 years ago, the more obvious this becomes. What we call history is not a neutral record. It is a reconstruction, layered, curated, incomplete. The first complicating force lies in colonial archaeology. Much of the earliest excavation in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley occurred under empires seeking to impose their own narratives on the past. British, French, German, and Ottoman expeditions were not merely scientific missions, they were political endeavors. Their interpretations often framed the ancient world in ways that reinforced European ideologies. Independent achievements of early civilizations were sometimes minimized, recontextualized, or misunderstood. When discoveries did not fit prevailing theories of cultural evolution, they were dismissed as anomalies, filed away in museum basements, or written off as misinterpretations. Göbekli Tepe, for example, now recognized as one of the oldest monumental complexes in the world, was initially ignored for years because it did not fit the accepted timeline. A place of stone pillars and animal reliefs thousands of years older than agriculture. Impossible. The earlier paradigm insisted that civilization follows agriculture, not vice versa. And so the site waited, dismissed, until evidence became undeniable. How many other sites, still unknown or reinterpreted through the lens of outdated assumptions, might hold clues to the forgotten chapters of human experience? Institutional inertia plays its role too. Academic frameworks, linguistic models, chronological charts, cultural sequences become entrenched. They form the scaffolding upon which careers, departments, and funding systems depend. New evidence threatening to destabilize these frameworks often faces resistance. Fringe theories, no matter how cautiously proposed, are met with skepticism, not only because they may be unscientific, but because institutions fear the collapse of coherence. A single disruptive discovery can force the rewriting of textbooks, the rethinking of cultural diffusion, the redating of entire epochs. And institutions like human memory prefer stability over uncertainty. Religious institutions contributed their own layers of selection. Ancient libraries across the Mediterranean and Near East filtered text according to theological priorities. Works deemed heretical, contradictory, or too deeply rooted in pre-Christian or pre-Islamic cosmologies were suppressed, burned, or quietly set aside. What survived often reflects what was acceptable, not what was true. The Library of Alexandria, often romanticized as a singular loss, was only one of many repositories that vanished. Heliopolis, Memphis, Nineveh, Haran, centers of ancient knowledge erased or fragmented by conquest and theological purging. These losses did not just remove information, they altered the shape of what remained. Imagine a tapestry burned at its edges. The surviving middle appears complete only because the missing sections have been forgotten. Even within scientific disciplines, certain assumptions became so ingrained that they shaped evidence itself. For decades, archaeologists assumed that writing must originate with economic administration. The earliest tablets from Mesopotamia reflected that assumption. But what if writing had older ritual or symbolic functions that left no durable record? What if economic tablets were merely the surviving tip of a much deeper symbolic iceberg? Archaeology, bound by the materials available, often privileges what survives: clay, stone, metal, while ignoring what would have perished: wood, fabric, oral traditions, ritual choreography, navigational knowledge, cosmology preserved in song. The result is a record skewed toward durability rather than significance. Then there is the challenge of radiocarbon dating. Though powerful, it is not infallible. Contamination, calibration, curve anomalies, environmental variations, and sample selection all affect results. In several regions, Anatolia, the Levant, the Indus Valley, isolated radiocarbon dates occasionally appear far older than the established timelines for urbanization, metallurgy, or symbolic activity. These outliers are usually discarded as noise, yet their pattern persists across continents. Could these represent remnants of earlier cultural layers, ones overshadowed by the neat chronological boundaries imposed on later discoveries? History's reconstruction becomes even more complicated when we consider the role of early modern scholarship. 18th and 19th century historians often arranged ancient civilizations into hierarchical sequences: Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Europe. This line of progression became so culturally ingrained that even today deviations from it feel suspect. Yet archaeological discoveries have repeatedly shown that civilizations did not arise in a single chain, but in a network of overlapping, interconnected, and often forgotten trajectories. The Sahara, once green, hosted complex societies whose contributions barely appear in mainstream narratives. The islands of Southeast Asia contained trading networks thousands of years old. The Americas developed monumental architecture, astronomy, and urban planning independently. Yet these traditions were often dismissed or minimized in early scholarship because they did not fit the perceived center of historical gravity. Even the concept of civilization itself is a construct, shaped by the availability of certain kinds of artifacts. Cultures that did not build in stone, did not write on clay, or did not produce durable objects often vanish from the historical record. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Entire symbolic worlds could have existed, rich, complex, sophisticated, and left behind only the faintest archaeological shadows. It is within this landscape of selective survival, institutional preference, theological curation, and interpretive bias that we attempt to reconstruct the past. The story we inherit is not wrong, but it is incomplete. It holds shape only because its missing pieces have been forgotten, the absence mistaken for inexistence. The result is a historical narrative with sharp edges where there should be gradients, with beginnings where there should be continuities, with mysteries labeled anomalies rather than clues. The gaps are not errors, they are signals. Signals that something older than recorded history may lie beneath our accepted frameworks. Something whose memory was fractured by climate shifts, population collapses, migrations, and the institutional forces that later shaped our understanding of civilization. The deeper question, then, is not whether modern history is accurate, but what it excludes. What symbolic systems dissolved before writing appeared? What cultural scaffolds collapsed during the resets of the early Holocene? What knowledge persisted only as myth, ritual, or architectural instinct? And most haunting of all, what memories were lost not because they were unimportant, but because the institutions responsible for preserving them lacked the context to understand what they held? History, as we receive it, is a reconstruction built atop ruins. And if those ruins conceal the remnants of a world older and stranger than we have ever imagined, then the final chapters of that forgotten world lie, not in the ground, but in the silences between the stories we tell. What then waits beyond those silences? What lies beneath the surface of the narrative so carefully polished over centuries? And if the missing pieces were ever revealed, if the true shape of the past emerged, how much of our understanding would remain standing? There is a moment, somewhere in the quiet space between the past we know and the past we have forgotten, when the mind begins to sense a deeper pattern, a faint, persistent echo threading through ruins, myths, anomalies, and silences. By the time we reach the threshold of 6,000 years ago, the ground beneath history feels thin, like a surface stretched over something older, something hidden. Every fragment we have traced, the sudden rise of cities, the unexplained leaps in symbolic systems, the architectural memories without origins, the astronomical alignments out of sync with their own epochs, forms a mosaic whose edges never quite align. And yet, taken together, these fragments point toward a possibility too subtle to claim and too compelling to ignore. That humanity is living in the aftermath of a story lost to time, not a story of impossible technology or spectacular civilizations beyond evidence, but a quieter, more haunting story of memory broken, continuity shattered, and knowledge carried forward only as faint residue. When the climate turned violent, when coastlines drowned beneath melting ice, when populations scattered and reformed, entire symbolic worlds collapsed. What survived lingered as instinct, ritual, myth, or architectural habit, echoes of something once whole. The more carefully one listens to the earlier civilizations, the more they seem to speak in the language of remembering. Sumerian scribes writing of kings before the flood, Egyptian priests restoring rites they no longer understood, Indus craftspeople standardizing bricks with ratios whose origins no one can trace, early Chinese chroniclers invoking sage kings who emerge from chaos. All these cultures behave less like inventors and more like inheritors, piecing together fragments of a story whose beginning they could no longer see. But if inheritance is the thread, then what was the loom? What world existed before the reset? Archaeology hints, but does not claim. Cognitive science describes how memory fractures under trauma. Geology reveals collapses sharp enough to erase entire landscapes. Mythology preserves shape without detail. Astronomy records alignments belonging to skies older than the societies that carved them. All these domains whisper into the same wind, and yet none speaks loudly enough to anchor certainty. The very boundaries of history, those neat lines in textbooks, dissolve under scrutiny. Cities emerge without precursors, scripts appear fully formed, cosmologies arrive with mature symbolic structures. Engineering feats begin at their peak and decline. The archaeological record behaves not like a story beginning, but like a story interrupted. Perhaps this is what the earliest storytellers were trying to explain when they spoke of floods, divine ages, cycles of creation and destruction. Perhaps the myths were their attempt to remember the rupture, the moment when the world they knew ceased to exist, when memory disintegrated, when continuity broke, when the long chain of human understanding narrowed into a handful of survivors carrying only fragments of what once was. It is not necessary to imagine a vanished civilization of impossible scale. The truth may be more subtle and far more human. A network of cultures whose knowledge, ritual complexity, astronomical awareness, and symbolic depth far exceeded what the archaeological record now showing their remains suggests. A world not erased by conspiracy, but by catastrophe. A world unable to transmit its memory across the abyss of those violent millennia. If so, then the 6,000-year threshold marks not the dawn of civilization, but the dawn of recovery. From this perspective, the suddenness of Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and early China is not abrupt at all. It is the visible reappearance of human complexity after a long silence. Their brilliance is real, but it glows with the melancholy of remembering rather than the triumph of invention. Their written records, instead of narrating origins, describe the faint outlines of a deeper history whose form they could feel but not reconstruct. Their monumental architectures respond to sky rhythms established long before their cities existed. Their myths describe not fantasies but shadows of memory flickering across generations. The evidence, fragmentary, inconsistent, incomplete, cannot answer the final question directly, but it can suggest a pattern. Each early civilization rose with an uncanny sense of déjà vu, as though rediscovering a script missing its first pages. This sensation, the feeling that humanity is living in a second beginning, echoes across time. It appears in the way cultures describe themselves as restorers of order. It appears in ancient laments about forgotten rites and lost words. It appears in the mathematical and astronomical systems that seem too mature for their earliest appearances. It appears in the uniformity of certain symbolic motifs, recurring across continents that had no known contact. It appears in the architectural instincts preserved long after their conceptual foundations vanished. But if history is the second beginning, then the first beginning lies somewhere just beyond our grasp, buried beneath floodplains, submerged under continental shelves, dissolved in the ruins of societies broken by ice, drought, sea, or volcanic ash, lost in the unrecorded migrations of communities fleeing landscapes that no longer existed, carried only in the rituals whose meanings faded even as the gesture survived. The deeper one contemplates this hidden horizon, the more quietly the world rearranges itself. Human history no longer feels like a straight line. It feels like a spiral, a pattern rising, collapsing, and rising again, each turn preserving less of the lost, And so we arrive at the present, standing at the far edge of a story whose earliest chapters remain invisible. The silence before 6,000 years ago does not feel like emptiness. It feels like a sealed chamber, one whose walls we can sense but not penetrate, whose contents we can intuit but not name. Perhaps there is no final revelation waiting in that silence. Perhaps the fragments we have, myths, anomalies, alignments, absent histories, are all that remain of a world too fragile to survive the violence of geological time. Or perhaps something still lies buried, waiting for the earth to shift just enough to expose a piece of the pattern we have been tracing in the dark. If humanity is indeed living in the aftermath of a forgotten age, then the question is not whether we will ever rediscover its full story. The question is whether we will recognize it when we do. For in the end, the deepest secrets of the past do not announce themselves. They linger quietly around us, beneath our cities, beneath our seas, beneath the surface of every myth we tell. Not calling for answers, but inviting us to listen. And in that invitation, there is a strange kind of calm, a reminder that the world is older, vaster, and more mysterious than our stories allow. A reminder that the silence behind history is not a void but a threshold. What waits on the other side of that threshold remains hidden, but its presence is unmistakable, like a faint light felt through stone. And perhaps that is enough, for now, to know that the story of humanity has not yet finished revealing itself, and that the past we think we understand may only be the final chapter of a book whose beginning was written in a language the world forgot long ago.